Hi, this is a PowerPoint video about the causes of the Civil War itself, and Reconstruction. So we start in the 1850s. Really, we start in 1849 when gold is discovered out here in California. And so there's the California Gold Rush, and many people move out to California. Then California has more people. It comes in as a free state without slavery because a lot of New England clipper ships had gone around and stopped in California on their way to and from Asia. And so it had a lot of New England northern influence. So California comes in as a free state. That pleased the North. So, what did Henry Clay, the great compromiser, do for the South? He created a new fugitive slave law, which said that fugitive slaves must be returned to the South, and the commissioners who would hear those, citizens in the North had to help return those slaves to the South. And commissioners in the North would be paid extra if they awarded the runaway slave to the Southern slave owners. So there was a financial incentive for the commissioners or judges to send the runaways back down to the South. After all, unfortunately, they were considered property. Here's Henry Clay, the great senator from Kentucky who did the Missouri Compromise of 1820. He got that through Congress, and the Tariff Compromise of 1833 and the Compromise of 1850. Of course, by this point, we have photographs, and there's a photograph of Henry Clay. He is going to die in 1852, and the death of that leading politician is one of the causes of the Civil War. So, what is the consequence or the result of the Fugitive Slave Act? The Underground Railroad really increases, and more slaves try to escape, not only to the north, but also to Canada. And here's a famous painting by Eastman Johnson of fugitive slaves trying to run away. That should remind you of another ride to liberty, and that was Paul Revere back in the Revolution, alerting the colonists. This composition, this imagery of the little family fleeing to safety was, of course, based on Christian tradition. And here you see a scene from the Bible with Joseph and Mary leading baby Jesus to Egypt for safety. Another leading politician at the time was John Calhoun, senator from South Carolina. And remember, he had been pro slavery, pro South, and in favor of nullification. And here's a photograph of the incredible face of Calhoun. Calhoun was in favor of state nullification. Daniel Webster was against it. Daniel Webster said states cannot do whatever they want. The United States is a union of we the people. And here is Black Dan Webster with his black features. He was from the North, from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And here is a great photo of Daniel Webster, God like Daniel. He and Henry Clay are going to die in 1852. And their death is one of the causes of the Civil War because those great politicians who had held the country together pass away. Another factor leading to the Civil War was Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And again, it opened the eyes of the North. A lot of Northerners realized slavery was horrible. Remember, there wasn't a lot of slavery up north. They didn't have television back then, or they didn't have the web. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have pictures. The South wasn't really talking about it. They called it the peculiar institution, not slavery. There was the gag rule in Congress. So the South tried to talk about it as little as possible. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is about this slave named Uncle Tom, who's very Christian, and he really stands up to the slave owner, the evil slave owner, Simon Legree. And there's another touching passage where the slave mother, Eliza, flees across the Ohio River with her baby girl. Okay, so here again is a picture of Uncle Tom, noble, stoic, enslaved African American, and Simon Legree, the evil slave trader, tries to break him, and he says, "Nope, you can't do it." This is a cheesy picture of Eliza running to safety across the Ohio River from the south to the north, holding her baby. These were emotional passages that opened the eyes of the North to the evils of slavery. Another person who was writing was William Lloyd Garrison. He was anti-slavery. He was in the North. He was in Boston. And he said that the Constitution is sinful because the Constitution let slavery continue. And he says this whole U.S. system is so corrupt and sinful because it lets slavery continue. You guys shouldn't even vote. So he was absolutely a white radical. And he's going to partner with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland, and he escapes, and he comes to the attention of William Lloyd Garrison, who recognized Frederick Douglass's incredible talents as a speaker and as a writer. And Frederick Douglass goes on to write and give speeches in the U.S. and in Europe. Another runaway slave from Maryland was Harriet Tubman, who escapes and goes back more than a dozen times to lead other enslaved people to freedom. So they called her the Black Moses because, like Moses, she led her people to freedom. Excuse me. Another African-American former slave was Sojourner Truth. She was actually enslaved in New York, I believe, very tall, about 6'3". And she not only fought for abolition, she also fought for women's rights. Stephen Douglas is known as the Little Giant. He was short, but he was a powerful, powerful politician. He's from Illinois, and he authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's in 1854, and here's a map. Basically, Stephen Douglas is a politician from Illinois, and he wants to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territory, get it all set up. Why? So that the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to provide a lot of jobs and a lot of tourists, will go across the northern route through his state of Illinois, through Kansas and Nebraska, and over to California. Again, lots of people are trying to get there for gold. So he does this Kansas-Nebraska Act. He gets that law through Congress. And basically, it allowed the voters, that is the male whites in Kansas and Nebraska, to decide for themselves whether or not to permit slavery. And this was called popular sovereignty. So it's up to the white men here, these farmers, whether or not they would have slavery. And so what that does is it basically erases the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Here, Kansas and Nebraska. And if they vote to have slavery, then you're going to have slavery north of that 3630 line. So this Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 erases the Missouri Compromise. It brings Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois lawyer, back into politics. His political hero was Henry Clay, and he wanted the country to be united. Okay? What did he think of slavery? He thought it was bad, but he's a moderate on slavery, unfortunately. Economically, he thought African Americans should be paid after a hard day of work. Socially, unfortunately, he did not see these enslaved people as the equal to whites. And politically, you're going to see at the end of the Civil War, he's okay with educated African Americans voting. 1857, you get the Dred Scott ruling. So Dred Scott was an enslaved person owned by his master up north, I think in Wisconsin and Illinois. And he sued and he said, there's no slavery up there. I should be free. And the Supreme Court gave this horrible, horrible ruling where the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, said African Americans are not citizens, therefore they cannot sue. And enslaved people are property. And just like you can take your cell phone to any state, the Supreme Court basically said you can take your property wherever you want. Again, this outlaws the Missouri Compromise. This is a famous painting. Again, Eastman Johnson is a famous American painter and shows you, it's called Negro Life at the South. So here you see African Americans relaxing in their free time, whether it's a little romance here or a little music or doing a little laundry. Here you see the white mistress poking her head in. So this was a window into the world of the African Americans. 1859, you get John Brown's raid on the federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So John Brown is a white abolitionist. He and his sons had gone to Bleeding, Kansas, and killed some whites who were in favor of slavery. And here's an incredible photograph of John Brown. This is a famous, famous painting in the Kansas State House in Topeka, Kansas. John Brown sort of, again, looks like a biblical prophet. Over here on the left, you get the North. On the right, you get the Confederates, the South. And, the storm is coming here. You see the dead soldiers. The Civil War is coming. It's like a prairie fire sweeping across the prairie. It's like a tornado coming. You get all this storm imagery. This is 1859. Famous painting here by Thomas Hovington. And here John Brown is coming out of the courthouse, and he's been convicted. He's found guilty. You're not allowed to attack a federal property, and he's going to be hanged. And here he kisses this little cute African-American kid because he was a friend of the African Americans. Here's John Brown going to his hanging. This is a much later painting, 1942, by Horace Pippin, who's an African-American painter. And you see the dominant color scheme he chose was black and white for obvious reasons. And here's John Brown tied up going to his hanging. This is the nightmare come true for the South. They're terrified that the North will give guns to the slaves. And here you see Harper's Ferry. It's in Virginia, about an hour outside of D.C. Here are my kids. And this is the firehouse where John Brown made his last stand. Okay, it's a firehouse. And Robert E. Lee was then officer for the U.S. Army, and he's sent out and arrests John Brown, and he's hanged, and he's killed. And the South is freaked out. Okay, the next thing that happens the next year is election of 1860. And the Democrats basically run two different people, one guy for the Southern Democrats, one guy for the Northern Democrats. That splits the Democratic vote, and Lincoln comes in and sweeps the North. He is a Republican. The Republicans were not going to attack slavery in the South because slaves were tragically and unfortunately and immorally considered property, and the Constitution protects property. What the Republicans wanted to do was prevent slavery in the West. And that's what Lincoln ran on. The southern states start to leave. And here again, you see Lincoln's inauguration. You can see him here speaking. He was very tall. He's about 6'3". And in the balcony above is John Wilkes Booth. Here it is again, John Wilkes Booth up above Lincoln. And John Wilkes Booth is going to kill him in 1865. Here you see Lincoln at the beginning of the war. Okay, pretty young man, and the war aged him tremendously as he tried to keep the country together. And you can see how old he was how old he looked, how much he had aged in 1865. John Wilkes Booth assassinated him, shot him at Ford's Theater. Quickly running through the Civil War, we have the Confederates dressed in gray, the rebels. Johnny Reb was the nickname of the common soldier. And here you see the Northern soldiers fighting for the Union, fighting to keep the country together. They were known as the Yankees, dressed in blue, and their common soldier's nickname was Billy Yank. All right, so here are your Northern states with all those factories and all those people and all those railroads. They had a lot of advantages. Okay, the South just had cash crops. And one of the things that helped the North were those border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. They had slavery, but they sided with the North. The fighting begins here in Charleston, South Carolina. The Northern troops were in this fort, Fort Sumter, and so they could control the harbor and control this key southern port. The South could not tolerate that. So the South bombarded this fort, okay? The South bombarded it. And they took it. They won that first battle of the Civil War. Okay, there it is with my daughter and me. All right, so it's a loss for the North. It's a military loss for Lincoln, but it's a political gain for him because the South attacked first, and now he's going to fight, with all of the North's might to keep the country together. The North's strategy was outlined by General Winfield Scott, and it's called the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda is a great big snake. And basically, they wanted to surround and strangle the South like a snake does. So the first part of the plan is they're going to blockade the coast so that the South cannot get out their cotton and their cash crops and sell them in Europe and get money to fight the war. Another thing is they're going to attack straight at Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. Also, they're going to try to take the Mississippi River and cut the South in half. The first real battle is the Battle of Bull Run in Manassas. It's in Northern Virginia. It's right outside D.C. Here's my kid, and here's a Northern reenactor and a Southern reenactor. And the elegant ladies from Washington came out literally to picnic on the hillside and watch these brave men fight. And everybody, Northerners, Southerners, ladies, picnickers, they saw limbs being blown off and people being shot and killed. And the North lost big time. They retreated, and everyone realized war is hell, and this is going to be a long war. The next key battle was Antietam. This is the next year, September 1862. McClellan actually had found the South's battle plans in some cigars that a Southern soldier had just dropped. So McClellan had the South's battle plans, and he basically still can't win. McClellan attacked up here, and then he attacked in the middle, and then he attacked down here, and attacking at 3 different times let the Southern General Lee reinforce his troops in the north, and then in the middle, and then in the south. McClellan should have attacked all at once. The battle is basically a draw, but the South retreats, so the North calls it a victory, and it is this victory that lets Lincoln say, on January 1st, 1863, I'm going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and that freed, it was supposed to free all the slaves in the rebelling areas in the South. Of course, the South was not listening to Lincoln, and so the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves, but it was a sign to England, please do not support the South. And it was also a sign to the Northern abolitionists that Lincoln was against slavery. Here is the famous Burnside's Bridge. Okay, this is down here in the South, and this is some of the bloodiest fighting in American history. Okay, and they're my kids. I took them there a couple years ago. So again, we have the South, and here are those border states. Tennessee, although sided with the South. The Emancipation Proclamation said that the slaves in the red areas were free, but those red areas were rebelling. They were not going to listen to Lincoln. So the Emancipation Proclamation, again, it was a military gesture. It's a gesture to please Northern abolitionists. It's a gesture to Britain, so Britain will not join with the South. Here are your major generals on both sides. At first, it's McClellan, who did a great job training the troops, but he was always hesitant to attack. And so Lincoln is going to turn in the second half of the war to Grant and Sherman, and they just kept coming. They're relentless. They just kept coming. And Robert E. Lee and the South did not have the men or the factories or the supplies to keep fighting. Robert E. Lee is arguably the greatest U.S. battlefield general, an amazing tactician. And here's Stonewall Jackson, who was his number 2 and the second best general. Here's Grant, a guy who'd failed at business, was basically an alcoholic, but found that he was good at war, and he became a war hero and later president. His number 2 general was Sherman. I believe Sherman had red hair, and after the war, he's going to go out west and unfortunately kill a lot of Native Americans. Here you see Robert E. Lee, this Virginia aristocrat. Lincoln offered him command in the Northern Army. He said, no, I've got to side with Virginia. That's my home. That's my state. So he led the Southern Army, and his number 2 was that strange, eccentric college professor, Stonewall Jackson. December 1862, the North charged right uphill, and Lee and the Southerners were dug in, and they beat the North. Here you can see the bullet holes are still in the buildings. Okay, and here's my son at Fredericksburg a couple years ago. It was stupid for the North to charge uphill, and the South beats them. Soon after, here's Fredericksburg, and soon after at Chancellorsville, which is just a couple miles away, the North outnumbered the South, and Lee did something highly unusual. He divided his troops, even though he was outnumbered, and he sent Stonewall Jackson around the left flank to surprise the North, and it was a huge, huge success. Here's the path through the woods that Stonewall Jackson took, and there's my son as a reenactor, and it was a huge victory. Chancellorsville is arguably Lee's greatest victory. Even though he was outnumbered by a lot, he beat the North. The problem was that late in the day, Stonewall Jackson was riding around in the forest trying to see, should we keep attacking? Should we keep attacking? And some of the Southern troops thought he was a Northern spy, and they shot him and they killed him. So the South lost their second best general. 6 months later, Lee goes into the North. He goes into Pennsylvania, and the armies bump into each other in Gettysburg, where a bunch of roads came together. On the first day, the armies bump into each other and they take up positions. On the second day, Lee attacks the northern right flank and Lee attacks the northern left flank. But Joshua Chamberlain, that Bowdoin College professor leading the 20th Maine Regiment, saves the day and saves the North's left flank here. So on the third day, Lee orders Pickett to charge right in the middle and try to split the Northern lines. It's a huge failure and a turning point in the Civil War. Here is the North's left flank on this little hill. It's called Little Round Top, and it was guarded and defended by Joshua Chamberlain. Okay, this very bookish Bowdoin professor. He spoke like 10 languages. And I took my kids to Gettysburg, and there is the battlefield monument. And on the third day, Lee told Pickett to come out of these woods and charge uphill across an open field and attack the North. It was a bad idea, and it backfired. The Southern troops basically got as far as the angle, and then they were shot down. Just by coincidence, the next day, the North won another huge battle. They took the fort at Vicksburg, and therefore they had the high ground overlooking the river, so they had control over the Mississippi River. So here you can see it. Gettysburg up here in Pennsylvania, and just by coincidence, the next day was July 4th, and Grant takes control of the Mississippi River, and the South is basically cut in two. Those are the three turning points. The third one's going to be Sherman capturing Atlanta and then marching to the sea. And that's also going to kind of cut the South in half. So the three turning points are Gettysburg, the North one, Vicksburg, the North one, and Sherman capturing Atlanta and his march to the sea. Sherman really destroyed Atlanta. He believed in total warfare. He didn't pull any punches. He destroyed the soldiers and the buildings and the factories. All right. And here you can see Richmond after the Civil War. Okay. So there was a lot of destruction, and about 500,000 Americans died. The North won because they had more men, more factories, more supplies, and the South just couldn't keep going. The key concept there is that your military strength depends on your economic strength. That's why the U.S. was able to beat Hitler and Japan in World War II.